Welcome to the EMD Campus Ministry Podcast. On this episode, we delve into the often controversial line of the Apostles' Creed that Jesus Christ descended to the dead. We explore what Scripture says about it, as well as why this is an important, albeit controversial, line in the Apostles' Creed. All right, so we are back, the EMD Campus Ministry Podcast. This time we're going over the next line, which is probably one of the most controversial lines in the Apostles' Creed. It's usually the one that are going to make people like really raise some questions and wonder like is this legit? Like is this like actually what we believe? Out of all the lines in the Creed, every time I bring it up, like every time I like would recite it at my church, this line always stuck out. I would always get a question about it, and it's the line, "He descended to the dead." Speaking of Christ, after he was crucified, dead, and buried, he descended to the dead. So we're going to explore a few things with that. Actually, first off, Jordan, you can take it away.
No, that's great. So, no, but Ben, I actually want to kind of reiterate your experience. You know, when we both were TAs for a Christian Forum, I would have a lot of people panic when we came to this line in the Creed, when we talked about the idea of Jesus ascending to the dead. Some translations even say descend into hell, and we'll get into that a little more. So, I don't want to tip our hand too much here, but the
Right.
idea that Christ didn't just like die and come back. You know, I think a lot of times people don't put a lot of thought into what happens in that 3-day period between when he's taken down the cross, put in the tomb, and then eventually the stone is rolled away, and it's really critical. One of the big things about this creed line, though, is it wanted to do two things, and we're going to talk about those two things. One, it wanted to prove a point, and we'll talk about how it wanted to combat the Gnostics. I'll define that term a little bit. And the second thing that it wanted to do was it wanted to establish an orthodox position and a biblical position, and we'll get into that a bit more as well. I think Ben, who's the much better biblical well, he's just better at translating and understanding foreign languages in the Bible and thinking it through. That's why he's going to lead that, because he's smart. Ben is smart. That's the takeaway here. You're smart. So anyway,
Oh, thank you.
yeah, the first thing we want to look at, though, is the idea that he descended into the dead. So here's the historical context. This is the most overt and obvious reason why it's in the Creed. The Gnostics, and I want to clarify this term. When I say Gnostics, and I've been saying this on multiple podcasts, I'm not simply just talking about one subgroup of people that were like, yeah, I'm a Gnostic. The Gnostics is a blanket term. It'd be like really using a name like the Christians or, the Catholics, right? Like it indicates a belief system. If you can say that about Catholics and Christians, because we'll talk about that in another podcast. But the idea that like, hey, I subscribe, or I understand, or I see the world through this lens, however you want to phrase it. The idea, when I say Gnostics, I'm talking about that group. And so a lot of them had commonalities. And remember, we've talked a lot about Platonism. So body bad, right? So if you are a spirit being and you are eternal by virtue of being a spirit being, because that's what Plato's one is, can you die? That's a rhetorical question. So I hope that you all in your head said no, because the answer is no. So Christ dying on the cross was a really, really, really problematic passage, specifically for people like Marcion and for the Docetists. Now, I'm not going to get into them in particular. We're just going to talk about Gnosticism in general and broad, because I think that's the big takeaway. And even the general, like, kind of subsets of Gnosticism really had a problem with this, because the idea that you could physically die was a big deal. Now, in terms of the descended part, right, that means that something happened. A lot of the Gnostics would try to do this, and they try to jump through these kind of, I call them intellectual hurdles, or I've also called them mental gymnastics. They do these mental gymnastics where they do all these flips and bends to try to make something work, to get from point A to point B. But what they would do is they would say things like, well, he died in appearance, his physical shell died, but his spirit, just went away. And they'll talk about the ascension as that passage, and we'll get into that in more detail and talk about why that's wrong. Or they'll say he only appeared to die, which is my favorite one. I don't know how you appear to bleed out and suffocate on a cross, but
I don't get it.
Apparently the Oscar goes to him because he pulled it off. Him and his
they did it in Sherlock Holmes, so
yeah, it's Sherlock Holmes. So it's Jesus and Robert Downey Jr. up for the all-time greatest death pick. Wow. Is this heresy? This fringe
Yeah,
heresy? I mean, I am
there's a
talking about
reference for
heresy.
you.
I'm literally talking about heresy. Never mind. So there's your
Yeah.
comedic moment for the pod. But so the Gnostics would say that Jesus did a Robert Downey Jr. impression, apparently, that he faked it because he was a spiritual being and he only appeared to be human. He only appeared to be physically done. So the descendant into the dead is a two-part line. It's saying that he did die and that he was dead for a period of time. It wasn't some kind of appearance. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't like a hustle or a leaving of a husk. The Jesus Christ, the man who is fully man and fully God, physically died on a cross. And we talked a lot about that in the last episode. He physically died. And then during his death, he descends into the dead. Now, this is, I think, a great point to transition over to Ben, who's going to kind of walk us through what that means in a bit more detail.
Yeah, because like on the face of it, this seems like a really redundant line, right? Because the previous line is he was crucified, dead, and buried. Like I don't know how you emphasize the fact that he died, like
Yes.
more than that. And then you have this line, which is a single line: he descended to the dead, or like you said, he descended into hell.
Yeah.
Um, so it's like, so there must be something else going on there, and you really highlight what it is that they're emphasizing that like he did physically die. It's not just that he appeared to be dead. Um, he physically died, and then also like he experienced that human death. So this is why you'll get like the different translations of like he descended into Hades, he descended into hell, along with he descended to the dead, and that's because what's one of the things that's being emphasized here is he actually went to the realm of the dead, which I believe is one of the translations you can get from this. I don't know how common it is. I think I've seen that before.
Yeah.
But just emphasizes that, yeah, he actually went to the place where dead people go, which, you know, Old Testament, you would have terms like Abraham's bosom or Sheol. New Testament, you'd have terms like Hades. These are very different, though, than like our common understanding of uh, where dead people go. So, I mean, just as a quick aside, a lot of our Western theology, when it comes to the afterlife, is built around you go to either heaven or you go to hell. Or if you're Catholic, then there's purgatory. But
Well,
it
so
sort of it's yeah, it sort of breaks it down into just those two categories, either heaven or hell. When r- really, uh, and for the early church, but you also see this in Old Testament and New Testament. Um, all people who die go to a common place. And again, that's where you get the terms like Hades or Sheol. It's not a place of eternal punishment. It's also not a place of uh, eternal union with the full like fellowship of God. It's just a place where the soul went. Um, so it's a very human experience. It's something everyone experienced, which also emphasizes the fact that Jesus really took on the fullness of humanity. That even when he died, he descended to where the dead people go, which is maybe a better term. I don't know. Everyone has their own idea. Hades really, you know, you get that connotation of hell, which is like eternal punishment,
I think
which
it's a
is not
different.
really the idea. Yeah, they're a little, so they're a little different. So this is where the language comes in. So in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, you have the term Gehenna, which is through through history and culture and all that actually became what we understand to be as hell. So that's why when the Greek word Gehenna is used in New Testament, a lot of times in English it'll be translated as hell. Gehenna was an actual place. It was like a junk pile there. Rob Bell in his book Love Wins kind of explores uh, how that affects our understanding of hell, but I'm not going to get into that. Um, but the point is, Gehenna is actually not what's used in the scripture passages that talks about Christ descending to the dead. Gehenna is not used. It's actually the Greek word Hades, which does have a slightly different feel to it because Hades um, was not the same idea as a place of eternal punishment. Hades is just the realm of the dead. Um, so, you know, good people, bad people, they all went to the same place. So that's more like the idea we're trying to get at. Abraham's bosom is also maybe another good one because it doesn't have those same connotations to us. like when Jesus talks about the rich man and Lazarus. Like they go to sort of this. They're in like slightly separate places, but these are both people who. Anyways, I'm sort of going on a tangent, but the point is that where Jesus descended, he did not descend to a place of eternal punishment, but he also did not go to heaven. He went to a place where all dead people go. And I think I'm sort of being a bit scattered on this because for a lot of us Westerners, we really don't think about this that much. And so even just talking about it can feel very awkward. Like it feels very um, abstract, uh, very intangible. So it's like, I don't know, we're just talking about science fiction or something. But this is an idea that's present in scripture, is that there is a place that you go when you die. Obviously not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense, and even in a conscious sense, which we'll get to this in a minute. You do go there, and so this was a place where Jesus went. So now I want to sort of transition into like, what did he do while he was there? Because, like you said, he was there for 3 days. Like that's a long time to be somewhere, especially for Jesus, because it's not like he just sat around and did nothing all the time. He was always doing something. So I guess I'll transition a little bit. There's a couple of scripture passages that talk about this. Most notably in the New Testament, you have Ephesians chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, where Paul talks about uh, Christ ascending, and then he clarifies and he says, well, how could we talk about Christ ascending unless he first descended? Where he's emphasizing there that the grandeur and the power of Christ's ascension is partly to be found in the fact that he descended to as far down as he could go, um, which is that it's not he just lived on Earth, in a place and a time. It's not like he took on humanity and lived among us, but he also experienced the same death that we experience, which made his victory over death all that more powerful because he actually died, and he was himself there in that place, and he was able to come back from that. So that's one passage that talks about it. The other one is First Peter chapter 3, verses 19 through 20. This one is a more abstract passage. You get a lot of different interpretations, but it it clarifies uh, what was going on when Jesus was there. And Peter explores this and says that while Jesus was there, he actually preached to the souls of those who had gone before, um, and essentially rescued them. So okay, so what does that mean, right? Because that's really strange too. So here's something that you have to wrestle with whenever you explore Scripture, whenever you explore salvation, is what happened to all those people before Christ that didn't know Christ. Like, how could they experience like full union with God? Like, how could they experience, salvation when like the cross that offered perfect atonement for sin hadn't happened yet? Right, so what happens to those people? Do they just get a free pass? Because if that's the case, then why send Jesus at all when what happened beforehand was sufficient enough? So obviously it wasn't sufficient enough, otherwise Christ wouldn't have come. So what Peter's talking about there is that while Jesus was there, he I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could say this, but essentially he revealed himself to those who had gone on before and was able to also liberate them. So people like the saints of the Old Testament, like David, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, going through the whole patriarchy and all that, which again like seems very abstract. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but when you start exploring it, it is very interesting. And it also makes a lot of sense, though, too, because it does resolve that question of, what about those people who never heard of Christ before? Do they just get a free pass? Well, no, because he did preach to them. He preached the gospel, is actually how, like, specifically, like, those are the words that are used. He preached the gospel to them. So he was the gospel. He revealed himself to them so that they were able to see that and were able to experience the same salvation that we could experience having been born on the other side of atonement. So no, that's really weird. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Britt.
No,
Um,
I did want to put a pin here before we move on to the last part. of the
Yeah.
intermediate state. And I want to just kind of talk real quick about just kind of the ramifications of what we're talking about. And I also don't want it to seem like we're glossing over some really, really dense stuff. So I'm sure most of you, because so Ben and I taught Christian form at our alma mater, which is all about Nazarene University in Bourbonnais, Illinois. Um,
Hmm.
in Christian form, what we would find is that a lot of people, great Christian people, wonderful Christian people, honest to goodness pursuing the will of God in their life, just anything that you could imagine, just it's good, they're good people. They would be really
Hmm.
shaken when they went to the creed, because sometimes they would have to talk or think about things that would force them to like reinvent the wheel. And so I try not to critique the church too much because this is Christ bride, but I will say that we as church leaders, anybody who's in a position of leadership in church, I would say there seems to be a big lack of emphasis, and it's gotten better, but historically there has been a meaningful lack of focus and accurate teaching on this subject. And this
Hmm.
subject is indicative of what we're going to talk about probably in the next couple podcasts, really, Ben. We're going to talk about
Yeah.
resurrection, spoilers. We haven't recorded it yet, so it's fine. Resurrection,
Yeah.
and we're also going to talk about general eschatology and salvation. This is not to say that your pastors and staff, priests, whoever, they're not teaching you about those things. Sunday school teachers. What I'm simply saying is this: there's a lot of information out there, and not all of it is super biblically nailed down. And what Ben and I are trying to do is talk about the biblical ramifications and how the early church, right, the people that have the absolute
Hmm.
closest and best access to what Christ was teaching and what the disciples were teaching, right? These are the closest resources we have, what they believed and what they said. So we just talked a lot about the really about hell and like life after death. And now you now have to wrestle with this stuff, and we want you to wrestle and think about it. But we also
Hmm.
want to like let you know that we get that what we just talked about, or what Ben just laid out in a very articulate way, is not something that you can just be like, well, okay. you know, like this is like really heavy. I don't know, Ben. I hope I'm not. I just
Yeah.
wanted to really make that point because, like, you know, ultimately our intended audience is just the general Christian. And I grew up the general Christian. I didn't hear about this stuff till I got
Hmm.
to college and I started taking class on like biblical history or just basic Christian doctrine. And I say that to say like the church historically, for evangelicals anyway, has
Hmm.
kind of moved a little bit away from this because what happened was they got intertwined and mired down in tradition, and I think they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. They wanted to have like the seeker friendly like open church movement, and that really I think peaked
Hmm.
in the '90s from my understanding of church history. Um,
Yeah.
but
At least in my experience, like I would agree with that
yeah,
too.
yeah, and that's not a bad thing. I'm not like the
Hmm.
intentions were great, right? Like what they wanted to do was bring people in. So I'm not going to offer a critique on the heart there because I think the heart was very clearly good. But what I am
Yeah.
saying is that maybe they made a mistake because you only have so much time and energy you can put into something. So you have to be really intentional about what you focus on. And if
Hmm.
you're trying to throw out all traditions, I think a lot of times these ministers and these churches will be like, you know what, we'll teach them doctrine later. And so what happens is that I think people in the back of their minds, like you listening to this podcast, right? You hunger for some correctness and some truth in your life. And sermons are a great place for that. But sometimes you need something a little different, you know, and the scripture is really good
Hmm.
for that. But, I'll be honest with you, reading scripture is a little challenging at times. Let's not act like it's the most compelling novel you've ever read. There's nothing wrong with saying that. It's not, it's dense, especially when you get to like the Old Testament or even sometimes Paul, because Paul is like super complex and uses like Greek logic, and you're like,
Hmm.
wait, what? You know what I mean? Like lays out these like really advanced, like
Yeah.
detailed arguments. And so what I'm
Hmm.
simply saying is that I think a lot of times people like you and I, right? You listener and me myself as I grew up, didn't have access to this stuff. And so
Hmm.
when we're trying to talk about different understandings of the word hell, this is a biblical thing and it's going to come up a lot. So if you don't hear anything else I just said in my little diatribe, go back and listen to Ben's diatribe again and just take a deep breath. We're going to get into it more, and we're going to get into it in a more clear way. But it's okay. We're not fundamentally undermining Christianity. I promise you.
Hmm.
I absolutely promise you. What we're doing
Yeah.
is we're trying to teach it to you in a way that is more accurate and more complete in a better whole picture. And what our hope is that this whole picture is going to allow you to grow in your faith and have more strength and confidence and be able to address in a healthy way some of the little gaps that maybe we don't notice or are kind of afraid to go to in Christian theism. So Ben, I'm sorry that I had to like hijack the podcast there, but I really wanted to say that because what you said was so good. But I also remember hearing it for the first time myself, and I was so distraught, just totally distraught.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is like it's so strange because you're right. Like people don't talk about it. I mean, generally, like who's writing books about this stuff? Who's writing songs about this stuff? Who's really preaching on this stuff? So yeah, like people just aren't. I mean, myself included.
It's not they're uneducated;
Like,
they're just not even given the information. That they're unintentionally
yeah,
and almost like
hmm
in a mean way held down ignorantly. And that's not, again, I don't want to like critique the church because I like I said, I'm very careful about critiquing Christ's bride. But
yeah,
as church leaders, as somebody who teaches in a church, because I teach a small group for sixth graders, and I have to be careful how I address those sixth graders because their brains aren't done developing yet. So you got to be like a little more concrete. They're great kids though, but you want to make sure what you're teaching them is I think you have to be really intentional about what you're teaching them is true.
yeah, yeah, very true. And like you said, make sure you're not just throwing stuff out because it might seem inconvenient. Um, because yeah, on the face of it, this is really abstract, but this is actually very important. Like because we're talking about what happens when you die,
And we all die.
which yeah, and everyone experiences this. Everyone has experienced losing someone. Um, and when I worked as a lead pastor, like this would come up fairly frequently. I'd either be at a funeral or I would just be with people, and uh, constantly, what came to mind was a phrase I learned in one of my doctrine classes, which is "good theology is good counsel." So what I had to do was I couldn't just use those simple phrases with people because it just felt wrong to me. Um, like so where are they? Like, are they in heaven? And it's just like, well, yeah, like they're in heaven. It was like the easy phrase, and it sounds nice, but it's so empty. I know that
Well,
sounds weird, right? Because we all want to imagine our loved ones are like in heaven, but at the same time, it's. I mean, okay, so that might be a bad example, but just
no,
the fact that we tend to take the easy road when we talk about death, and what we end up doing is we end up helping people construct very incomplete and sometimes very harmful ideas about this to the point that people just become very confused. And I'm talking on behalf of myself too. Like when I first heard this, like I was just so confused by this phrase, "he descended to the dead," and then unpacking that and what that meant, and then taking classes in pastoral counseling where we talked about how you help people grieve and what do we understand about that, what does scripture say about death. Like that was all very new to me, and I grew up in the church, but at the same time, having been educated in this, I'm sure you could say the same thing. You see much more clearly how much people suffer from either poor or uh, just incomplete theologies on this. And it's not even, each person's fault. Like, I'm not saying that, like you said, it's not like I'm saying anyone's dumb.
no,
It's just because as church leaders, we don't tend to talk about this. So a lot of people don't really have a frame of reference for this.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it encouraging and edifying. If you want to connect with us, find us on Facebook or check out emdcampusministry.org to support the ministry. Thanks very much, guys.